on to the next story, which is about Garland Nixon. So Garland Nixon, he has a YouTube show called Garland Nixon. He also hosts a radio show in DC. I'm pretty sure that's how a lot of you probably heard of him before he had the YouTube show. But Garland Nixon actually just spoke at the United Nations in reference to the war in Ukraine. And I think you need to hear what he had to say. Let's go ahead and share this.
Okay. My name is Garland Nixon, and I'm a retired police official, a journalist, and in my opinion, a representative of the working class citizens of the United States. As a student of history, I recognize that the location of the United States has, with a few notable exceptions, shielded our land from the decimation of war. I also recognize that the proliferation of nuclear weapons has eliminated that geographical advantage, and the people of this nation face the same existential threat as the many nations that were literally flattened during 2 world wars. In February of 2022, Russia elected to enter the military conflict in Ukraine, and we, average working class citizens, were provided by our media with an assortment of shallow, simplistic, and often conflicting reasons for that action. Fortunately, many of us knew the truth about the potential for this escalation long before it flared up. We recall that in 2019, Alexei Arestovich, a close advisor to President Zelensky, was quoted as saying, "With a probability of 99.9%, our price for joining NATO is a big war with Russia." We recall Professor John Mearsheimer's prophetic prediction that, quote, "The West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path, and the end result is Ukraine is going to get wrecked." And lastly, we recall the list of security demands centered around NATO expansion that Russia issued on December 17th, 2021. Notwithstanding the ahistorical claims of Russian expansion or President Putin's hostility towards democracy, we find ourselves today in an extinction level crisis that can and must be resolved through diplomacy.
And we want to think about what's happening right now with Ukraine, right? When they talk about Ukraine going down that troubling path, look at where they are now and what's going to happen to this country after this conflict is over.
That was initially proposed in mid-December of 2021. Since the February 2022 entrance of the Russian military into the battle, the United States government has injected over $100 billion in arms and other forms of assistance to the conflict. A significant portion of that assistance took the form of small but powerful armaments. Many of these handheld weapons possess incredible destructive capabilities. There are shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons known as man-pads that can easily take down a civilian passenger aircraft, and anti-tank rockets that could be used with devastating effect on a convoy of civilian vehicles, such as the ones that many diplomats in this room routinely utilize to traverse their respective nations. The injection of these military-grade weapons into an environment as unstable as Ukraine is beyond irresponsible. In the instance of the European Union, it may end up being suicidal for many of its citizens. We are already confronted with instances of weapons from this conflict finding their way via the black market to Africa, which means that the nations of Europe are most likely already inundated with dangerous military hardware. The leaders of Europe must recognize that this conflict will eventually come to a conclusion. And when that happens, the powerful weapons of war that will have flooded their society will not simply melt away.
I just want to pause here for a second and talk about those weapons that have ended up elsewhere. The U.S. government has not issued a response in reference to that. It was a couple months ago we covered the story that people were saying like they found some of those weapons ended up in countries in Africa, and there just seemed to be no response. How did they get there? You know how dangerous that is, the fact that military grade weapons can end up in the hands of civilians? No response, no accountability. Almost as if they're trying to provoke them to. Let's go on.
Most violent and criminal elements in Europe and beyond will possess the ability to threaten the internal stability of any nation that they choose. They will need no army or organized structure. A lone wolf attacker with an anti-aircraft or an anti-tank missile will be able to destabilize an entire nation with a single act. Who amongst us would be comfortable taking a commercial flight if criminal or terrorist actors shoot down a civilian plane in Paris, London, or Brussels? I can guarantee that just the mention of this potential tragedy is eliciting a fear response in those of us who routinely travel on commercial aircraft in the European region. I only wish that the inevitable ad hominem attacks against me as a speaker would change this outcome. It would be a fair and reasonable burden to accept if those who would diminish the obvious nature of my assertions could somehow alter the ghastly inevitability that the innocent citizens of Europe will be forced to endure. I implore the honorable members of this committee to push for a peaceful resolution of this conflict and an expansive project to locate and gather up the brutal weapons that will surely threaten the lives and livelihoods of the hardworking citizens of the European continent and beyond.
It's something you really need to think about, the fact that nobody from the US government or the Ukrainian government has said, okay, we need to send people to those countries to try to gather those weapons. Like, you have military grade weapons just kind of floating around in the mist, can get into the hands of anyone. And there just seems to be no care in the world, no concern, no worry, no stress. Like I said, it almost seems like they're not trying to take care of this situation, because it's almost as if they want them to use it not against us, against their own people. Just let them have it. Look at where it ends up. Countries are in Africa. It's crazy that Garland even has to come to the UN and tell them this.
I need not recite word for word the innumerable recent quotes from Western media outlets implying that the argument for a Ukrainian victory against the Russian army is no longer plausible. According to reliable sources, the Ukrainian military has lost more personnel in the last few months than the U.S. military lost in a decade of fighting in its ill-fated misadventure in Vietnam. The highly trained and powerfully equipped NATO-sponsored military that opened the conflict has been wiped out and replaced by conscripts. These minimally trained troops are being placed in a hopeless situation. Those who claim to support Ukraine must recognize that putting civilians in camouflage fatigues, giving them a few weeks of training, and setting them off against impregnable defensive positions is an unconscionable act of human sacrifice.
It would be the same as if I came up to one of you and I said, okay, all the actual soldiers are gone, so we need you to fight. I'm just going to train you for a week or so, and then you just take it from there. Hey, in combat? Could you imagine? Just scooping up anybody. We need more people, so we're making you come fight because the trained soldiers that we had are gone. This is a dangerous thing. And so I've continued to say that if you care about the Ukrainian people, if you care about the Russian people, then there should be a call for a peace negotiation and de-escalation, not escalation. Because I think we all know where this is headed. We've already talked about this before. Cy Hirsch has reported on this extensively, that Ukraine is losing. They're really struggling. Russia's huge. Plus, they got a friend next door called China. You really think that Russia's going to let them win this? They're not. To me, this makes no sense. De-escalate. It only makes sense if you're trying to profit off of war, which is what our country does.
Supporting a nation obviously entails ensuring that the safety and prosperity of its citizens are secure. Recent statements and advertisements by U.S. supporters of this conflict makes it clear that they are unconcerned with the human consequences of their decisions and clearly demonstrate a reckless disregard for the lives of the Ukrainian people. Recently, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham stated that, quote, "Russians dying, the best money U.S. has ever spent."
Lindsey Graham has to be one of the biggest war hawks in DC. But not only that, he has said some of the most vile things about people. I am shocked. I'm still shocked to this day. There hasn't been some kind of push to get him out of DC. That people still continue to vote for this guy. It is, and I lived in South Carolina. I didn't understand it then either. Like, why do you continue to vote for this guy? He's not doing anything for people in South Carolina. But that's how Lindsey Graham sees people abroad.
In this amoral but incredibly enlightening statement, Senator Graham openly exposed that he viewed the appalling numbers of dead Ukrainian soldiers as an insignificant and reasonable price to pay to achieve his ultimate political goal of weakening the Russian military. With supporters like Senator Graham, Ukraine is in little need of adversaries.
It's easy to tell people in conflict and with war, it's a price to pay. It just comes along with it, right? Like there's gonna be civilian casualties. It's easy to say that when you're not the casualty. It's easy to say that when it's happening in another country and it's not happening in your country. If the United States government, if we had as much conflict in this country in reference to war, like if we were the ones being attacked all the time and we were the ones having to live with buildings next to us that have just been demolished and there's just rubble, next to us that has not been cleaned up or anything like that. And we had to breathe in the air from the chemicals that happened through war. If we had to live like that, if we had to figure out how we were going to get water, how we were going to get food, because all our entire state or whatever, or our entire country was destroyed the way that Yemen was, the way that they're doing Syria, the way that they did Afghanistan, we would not say that. We would not say, well, that's just part of the casualties of war. The people who usually say that are the people who are not affected and the countries that are not affected.
Additionally, it is critical that we consider the economic health of the hardworking people of Europe. As the makers of the aforementioned weapons of war celebrate outrageous profits, the loss of cost-effective Russian energy has set in motion a deadly downward economic spiral. The people of Europe are facing another cold winter with unaffordable heating costs and the very real prospect of industrial collapse.
Now, we talked about this last year during the winter, how they had the really expensive heating bills that they couldn't pay for, like in the UK. So people had to go to warm banks in the UK they were basically heating facilities. We talked about this last year. Now we're going into another winter. So this is still a problem. And that's what I'm telling people, that like this energy problem has not gone away. So when Joe Biden talks about, oh, everybody's doing so much better now, no, this is still an issue.
The potential for such an economic catastrophe has already sowed the seeds of political and cultural instability. Governments have begun to fall, and should the current Middle East crisis metastasize, a winter without Russian energy would result in the immediate and precipitous demise of the European economic bloc. I only wish that this claim were over the top and improbable. It is clear and obvious that the prosperity of the European region is facing great peril, and we must ask ourselves whether it is moral and just to destroy centuries of economic and cultural advancement for an esoteric ideological battle. Today, we face an incredibly dangerous situation, a situation that could, without notice, spiral out of control and turn our beautiful planet into an icy, uninhabited rock. However, despite the existential threat that this conflict represents, I am pleased to bring good news to this committee. Despite the devastation and loss of life that this war has visited upon the European continent, there is hope. We have a roadmap for peace, and if reasonable diplomatic-minded leaders can find the intellectual and moral wherewithal to act with haste and determination, a resolution for this conflict can give birth to a security structure that ensures peace and stability on the European continent and beyond.
Let me pause here for just a second. There was something I want to add in reference to the solution about peace. It was a couple of months ago when I covered that story where it was actually Putin and Xi Jinping. They actually met to talk about like a possible peace negotiation in reference to this particular conflict. They talked about other issues as well, but they also talked about this. And then it seemed like right after they met, that meeting happened. The next thing I know, there was another headline that the US government was sending more weapons to Ukraine. So you see, we've seen this happen before. Because when we talk about the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which actually could have settled this issue between Israel and Palestine back in 2002, one of the things that I read to you from that article was the fact that once they started talking about the peace negotiations, what happened? Weapons came in and there was an attack. So that's what I'm saying. Like, they don't want peace. They want what's profitable for the war machine. They want to continue to feed the war machine. So that being said, here we are again with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where they had that discussion, they had that meeting to talk about peace negotiation. And it seemed like, from what I saw from the meeting they had, it seemed like Vladimir Putin was open to that. And then the US government sends more aid to Ukraine, weapons to Ukraine. Because the US government doesn't want peace.
However, the first and most important act required to set this desired outcome into motion is that the Western nations immediately cease contributing to the influx of weapons and secure the lives of the frontline Ukrainian troops by offering a unilateral ceasefire with a guarantee wherein non-aligned nations, such as those in Africa and Latin America, are authorized to ensure that this agreement is not compromised. This is not to be confused with propositions for a ceasefire that simply allow the Ukrainian military to rearm for the furtherance of future conflict. Due to the nuclear potential of this conflict, developing nations have a stake in the outcome, and therefore they must be involved in its resolution. I call upon this committee to live up to its name. This unity of nations has been called upon to ensure world security. From the instance that nuclear weapons were introduced into the military sphere, this time was inevitable. A time in which irresponsible leaders would threaten the existence of humankind was sure to visit itself upon humans. However, we must also remember that this inevitability was the very foundation for the creation of this committee. I ask you to take action and live up to your calling. Stop the flow of weapons into the Ukrainian theater, push for an end to hostilities, and work for a resolution of the European security that takes into account the security of the European nations, the Russian Federation, and the overall threat that this conflict presents to the existence of humanity. I conclude by reminding you that even as we seek to conclude this conflict with a peaceful resolution, a second wind of ill fate blows across our planet. Of the three major nuclear superpowers, the one in which I reside is pumping billions of dollars of weapons into the border of one and literally into a province of the other. The reckless act of destabilizing and weaponizing Ukraine has a loathsome and vile twin on the Chinese island of Taiwan. Again, I remind you of the words of the ever hawkish Senator Lindsey Graham, who, when speaking about the Ukraine conflict, referenced Taiwan by stating that, quote, "They are going to fight to the last man in Taiwan." This suicidal march towards nuclear conflict must be stopped. And I beseech you to begin the process immediately by stopping the flow of weapons to Ukraine and expediting a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Thank you and good day.
Now, one of the questions that I have, and I'll actually, I'm gonna reach out to Garland and ask him about this. When they have these speeches at the UN, what happens after? Because I think that's the part where many of us were just like, oh, okay, what happens next? Like, does the UN, respond? Do they send a message to the president of the United States? Like, where does it go from here? So we've done a couple of these. We had Garland Nixon's speech. We had Danny Haifong's address to the UN. Max Blumenthal addressed the UN. Aaron Mate, we covered, addressed the UN. There's been a couple of them that we've covered on the show. But I'm just curious, like, what happens after? Like, what are the next steps? See, this is why I couldn't address the UN, because at the end of the conversation, I would say, so what happens next? What are the next steps? They would just probably just look at me and laugh and say, like, oh my God, is she serious? What is she talking about? I'm like, no, seriously, what's the next step, guys? I don't know. I'm just curious. We'll go ahead and finish up here. And there's Garland there.
All righty. Well, that was it. I really enjoyed it. I took my time and wrote it, and I felt as though I played with it a little bit, but I felt as though the things that I said were obvious and needed to be said. The funny thing about it was, the real funny thing about it was, after I gave the speech, all the nations were around, and I looked at the guy from the UK, whoever their representation ambassador, whatever the case may be, right? And he gave me the, as we used to say when I was a kid, he gave me the hairy eyeball. He's looking at me with this mean look, and I just looked back at him and smiled. Because, you know, the Zen thing, you always respond in a way that people don't expect, and it can't be contrived. So he looked at me, and I looked back with a smile. That was the highlight of my visit to the UN, to tell you the truth. And I feel as though that was representative of the people who want war versus the people who want peace. The people who are the pro-war, the neocons, you know, they look at us with this, we hate you. And we look back and say, we don't hate you. We don't hate anybody. Right. We want everybody to be able to pursue their life goals, to enjoy themselves, for everybody to be treated equally, all that kind of stuff. And we don't have to go around screaming about it. So, thanks a lot, everybody. That's it. I'm going to run.
Yeah. So Garland brought up a really good point there, you know, like when, and I think this is something that I think Bree's really good at doing this too. Like when people are like yelling at you, or you face those types of people, whether it's the United Nations or whether it's in media as well, it's always great to just look back and give a good, big, fat, juicy smile. Just give shine a big old smile at them, you know, just be like, thanks so much for having me on. You know, you can win the argument with your words. And the way that I talk on this show, sometimes I get a little like, on this show. But when I go into other shows, like I'm very cautious of not letting my emotions do the talking and letting my words do the talking. So I try to be careful with that, because then the first thing people say is, oh, she's getting mad. She's getting angry. Here it comes. And then the next thing you know, people aren't paying attention to what you're saying. They're paying attention to your emotion in it and all. So it's different when I'm on this show. But if I'm going on to someone else's show and they're trying to argue with me about a particular topic, flash that beautiful smile. Let them see your pearly whites and keep it moving. Keep it moving. All right, let's go to some of the comments here. Steve Wolfbrand says, we watch Garland. Awesome. Yeah, Garland's channel is really cool. I know, like, he interviews a lot of people in reference to foreign policy. So, you know, I guess everybody's paying attention to foreign policy now, considering the conflicts that are going on. But if that's more your jam, like, Garland's channel is really good on that. Thank you. Stay blessed. Unfuck your mind. There is no special group of people who are entitled. One world, one love. Let's get together and feel all right. What's up, Scott? Thank you. In 2020, liberals were riding with Biden. In 2024, they're genociding with Biden to save democracy? Oof. And Lucas says, Sabs, you have to do it. ROFL. Yeah, it would be funny, like, if I went there, because I would seriously be like, no, seriously, like, what are the next steps? Are we going to have a second meeting? You guys going to contact some people? Like, what's happening here? Let me know. Let me know.